We're continuing our themes of, our deal of looking at different themes from the desert, going through Numbers. We've looked at shepherds. We've looked at 4 different types of trees. Anybody remember what they are? Acacia's one. Rotum's another. That's good. There is one that begins with a T. Tamarisk. And then lastly, what was the one that looks good, but is actually not good? Arah. You weren't even here. You've rewatched. Well done. Gold points for Debs. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking about water, and I've got 3 images that we're going to sort of go through around water. And the importance of water. Fairly important in our reading, wouldn't you say? They're complaining. I love the fact they complain about not having water, and then they whinge about also not having figs. They can come to my garden and take my figs. They always go to rot. We've got a fig tree in our garden. They never grow very big. Anyway, and pomegranates and grapevines and stuff. But really they're wanting water, but they're also going to they tack on food onto that. That's quite an interesting reading. Now, I wonder what you picture when you think of deserts in the Bible. Do you picture, a little bit like me, the Lawrence of Arabia type of desert, where it's like sand dunes and like you can see for miles, and a few people shaking their heads and stuff, which is good, because actually one of the things that you know or you should notice about the desert, and I've only ever experienced this in pictures. I've not been there. I want to go there eventually. Not a great place to go at the moment, but the deserts in the Bible are the Negev, the Paran, and the Zin desert. Which we've had read about today, and actually they're slightly different. Instead of being able to see for miles, they're actually it's all full of rocks, because the desert of the Bible is what are full of what are called wadis. Wadis. Well, wadi is the single, but you can pluralize it. And what happens? Wadis are created by water running through, and it carves its way through the sand and the rock, and there's not much rain that happens in the desert. In fact, there's not much rain that happens really in Israel. It rains for about they have a rainy season around about 2 months, and that's what kind of creates these wadis, and it carves really deep into the sand and into the rock, and essentially it's the water actually doesn't typically fall in the desert because it's a desert, and what happens is it falls on the Judean hills or around Jerusalem and Bethlehem and all that sort of stuff, and because it's so dry, it just runs down essentially the Rift Valley and other valleys and stuff, and out towards the Dead Sea or towards the Med, and it cuts these wadis, these valleys, these things into the desert, into the ground, and it creates these canyons. And when you wander through the desert, so I've been told, what you're really walking through is the bottom of these wadis. And there's many different wadis, and it's one of the reasons why it's so easy to get lost in the desert, particularly because they're not massive places. Like it's not like the Sahara, which is huge, and that you've got the rolling sand dunes and all that, and that's why it's easy to get lost there, because it's massive. These aren't. They're big, but they're not massive in comparison. But it's really easy to get lost. Now, one of my favorite stories about getting lost, I've probably told a million times because it is one of my favorite stories about getting lost, is when we was a kid, my mum and dad, we tend to when we take our kids on holiday, we take our kids to places that we think they're going to enjoy, and we can fill them full of activities, keep them entertained, all that sort of thing. Not my mum and dad's idea. My mum and dad used to take me bird watching. And that's what our family holidays were. We would go in a caravan and we'd go bird watching. Now, I remember one time we went to this place, little island called Texel. I know I've told this story before, but I will very quickly tell you again because it's hilarious, or I find it hilarious anyway, because it makes my dad look silly. Texel is this tiny, tiny, tiny little island just off the coast of Holland in the North Sea. It's got two roads, one which goes around the circumference of the island and one that cuts through the middle. Two roads, that is it. And my dad managed to get lost. It seemed like for hours. It was probably about half an hour as I was driving around the circumference of this thing going like, oh, do I turn left or right here? It's like it didn't matter. You know, if you turned, you was going to find the campsite because it was in the middle of the island off this road. It's so important, isn't it, that we know that the people who are leading us know where they're going, because it's quite stressful. And even in today's age, with the glories of sat-nav and stuff like that, sometimes particularly when sat-navs first came on the scene, how many times did we see stories of people who followed sat-navs blindly when they said turn right? And it was either down a one-way street and you're just coming the wrong way, or into a river, you know, because it's told you to turn right 50 yards too soon, or something like that. You see, it's so easy to get lost. And it's so easy to get lost in these deserts because you can't see much more than 50 yards in front of you. Because actually what it is, because like I say, you're walking mainly down the bottom of these wadis, which are kind of like cliff faces all over the place. You literally look in front of you and there's a rock face. You turn to the left and there's a rock face. You turn to the right and there's a rock face. You look behind you, there's a rock face. And you're just surrounded by rocks and cliff faces and wadi, and you can't really see where you're going. And I don't know if that's what you picture when you picture desert, but that's what it's like. And it's certainly not what I picture when I read about deserts in the Bible, because we're so conditioned to, you know, movies of the desert rats in World War II, or what's it called? The Mummy with Ashton, whatever his name is, not Ashton, Brandon Fraser. Where it's lots and lots of sand, and we don't know this, but it's really easy to get lost. And again, actually, what this does is that this brings us back to that very first image that we talked about, that image of shepherds, because when you don't know where you're going, it's really important to be able to know that we can hear the voice of the one who's leading us, and recognize his voice, and recognize where he's taking us. And we learn how to follow his voice. And I think that one of the things that we experience in desert times, in the times where it's tough, is actually learning and understanding how to hear the voice of God. Because it's not, we know, don't we, from our own experiences, the metaphorical deserts in our lives, when things aren't easy, it's not always easy to hear the voice of God. And yet, when we push on and push through, sometimes not sometimes, my experience tells me, actually, quite often with hindsight, we can look back and we go, I learned this lesson last time life was tough, and this is how I heard God. And so when we go through those desert times again, when we experience hardship again, we can go, this is the thing that hooked me in. This is how I heard his voice. This is where I was able to stay on track. So often, though, people freak out. And we do. We kind of freak out because we all want to know where we're going, don't we? And we kind of think it's not okay to not know where we're going. There's all sorts of promises in the Bible. It's great. It was really... It's always really interesting talking to young people, especially young people who have grown up in faith, because there's so many of them that you go, what's your favorite verse in the Bible? And they'll go, it's Jeremiah 29:11, which says, for the Lord has plans for me, plans to see me prosper, and I can't remember offhand. I should have written it down. Not to bring me harm. And that's great. And it's true. And it's absolutely right. But we kind of read that from a Western perspective that goes, well, if God's got plans for me, I'll know what those plans are too. It doesn't say that. And actually, quite often we need to think about more of the calling of Abraham, where Abraham's in this town, in this city, miles and miles and miles away from the promised land, and he experiences Yahweh, and he encounters God, and God calls him and says, if you follow me, I will take you to a land where you will be a nation and which will bring blessing. And Abraham says, yeah, great, we'll do that. Where am I going? And God says, I'll tell you when I get there. That's the Gavin translation, by the way. The problem is the attitude of thinking that's not okay for me to not know where we're going. That's the problem, because there is a lesson to learn in not knowing. And that lesson is a lesson of trust. Time and time and time again, we've talked about learning to trust the story. If it's all revealed to us, then how on earth are we meant to trust? As a Westerner, as somebody who thinks quite strategically, and I have plans, lots and lots and lots of different plans. Just talk to any of the staff team, and they'll kind of go, "What on earth's this week's plan?" And it's all to get into one direction, one place, one thing, but quite often we want to know, we want to just hold on to these plans and these ideas and grasp hold of them and go like, this is it, this is the strength. And the problem is that if we approach our relationship with God in that way, in that demand of saying, we need to know all the answers. We need to know where we're going. We need to have. I think we've actually got a bit of a problem, because we're not learning to trust, and we're not learning to hear His voice. And we like to think we know where we're going, but actually, I think as I've grown, as I've got older, even in my control freakiness sort of way, because I am a bit of a control freak. Being able to hear the voice of God and learning to trust and learning to step out in faith, it's about letting go of that control quite a lot. I'm a really bad participant in teams. I like to be in charge. Quite often I find myself in places in charge and without even meaning to. And it's a hard lesson to learn to let go and let other people, and particularly let God take charge. And this is what the Wadi teaches us, actually, because we can't see more than 50 yards in front of us. We need to trust that in the desert, sometimes, we know, don't we, actually, in our metaphorical experiences of the desert, and in our sense of, when we're going through hard times, when things are difficult, when we feel dry and maybe a bit distant and stuff like that, actually, we think, I can't see where the next turn is, where God is leading. Actually, that's what God's calling us into. That's how he's using these chances, these experiences. Deserts come in our lives. We know this. And he uses those times to teach us to hear his voice. It's not that he goes, "Oh, you're doing too well, so I'm going to take you to this place. And I'm going to humble you and stuff." No, that's not how. I don't think that's how God works. But there are times we know in this life there are hardships, there are persecutions, there are struggles. This is not heaven on earth, not yet. And so, we get to learn in those times to go, okay, where is my master's voice? What's he calling me to? Am I to go left, right, straight onwards, or backwards? See, nothing's taught me more about that in my life than the metaphorical deserts I go through, the spiritual deserts that I've had to live through. That's wadis. We know them, don't we? We can feel those times where we talk about it, don't we? You feel you're banging your head against a brick wall. That's a wadi. Or you're standing on a cliff edge. That's a wadi. And it's carved out by water. It's really important. The next image that I want to talk about is, again, excuse my dodgy pronunciation of Hebrew with a Yorkshire dialect. But it is it's the image of Mayam Kayam. That's spelled M-A-I-M-C-H-A-I-M, 2 words, Mayam Kayam. And it means living water. Now, Mayam Kayam is actually a place in the deserts, and it's called En-Gedi. And we're going to talk about En-Gedi a little bit. If you've ever been to the Negev, some of you may have been to the Negev, you may happen to wander upon En-Gedi as a place. And you'll know it because nowadays there's a nice little sign that says, welcome to the En-Gedi, because it's a nature reserve in Israel. Which sounds pretty ridiculous because it's the middle of a desert, and suddenly there's this nature reserve. And En-Gedi actually means spring of the deer. And it's a natural oasis where there is a spring that comes out in the middle of the Negev, in the middle of the desert. And this is something that happens in occasional places all throughout deserts in the Bible. And every now and then, there will be this oasis in the middle of nowhere. And now the Negev is just a barren wasteland. And then right when you're on top of it, all of a sudden, apparently, you'll hear this sound of rushing waters. And then literally, before you even see anything, because literally a few steps later, all of a sudden you're on top of this waterfall. And all of a sudden bushes and trees and green and lushness and stuff is literally in front of you out of nowhere at the bottom of this wadi. Someone do me a favor. Find for me Psalm 63. Here's a little race. Didn't tell you I was going to do a sword drill today, did we? Who's got it? Go on in. Start reading. No. Stop. Go back a little bit. Brilliant. A Psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. Did that on purpose, aren't I naughty? We skip over those little introduction things of the Psalms so often. And I doubt that any of us actually care too much, because half the time it will say like a song written by Asaph and his sons. And it's like, well, who on earth was Asaph and his sons? We have no idea. But actually this puts this psalm into its context. So when we read it, when we hear it, when we go through it, it's so important to go, this is David writing in the wilderness. He's in the desert. Go on then, Mo, keep reading. Great, that'll do. So right there, so just for those who, because I didn't run over with a mic for Mo, but for those who are watching at home, it says this, it says, you God are my God, earnestly I seek you, I thirst for you, my whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I've seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and glory. And so we have this thirst, this dry and parched land. God is our living water, our Mayam Kayam, living water. And if you've ever been to the desert or just lived through a heat wave in this country, you can connect with that passage in a way that we couldn't before, because actually David's writing from a desert. He's writing from a place of not just being spiritually thirsty, because we can over spiritualize this stuff too much sometimes. He's writing from a point of going like, I am thirsty, I am, and yet God is my Mayam Kayam, my living water, my Engedi. God, you are my Engedi. And just like we did with the Rotem bush, just like we did with the acacia, just like we did with shade, we see in the Bible that the authors do something incredible. And Jesus does this later on as well. I use this as an example in baptism, where he says something about himself and then flips it onto us. If you remember, God says, I am your shade. I mean, he calls his people to be shade for other people. And in the same way, he says, I am your living water, but he also flips it onto us. And just to finish it off, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And then he flips it, doesn't he? He says, you are the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Go and be light to other people. See, not only is God our shade, not only is God as our Engedi, our living water, our Mayam Kayam, God is going to ask us to be this for other people as well. So let's turn to Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 13. It says this, just before you get there. It says, my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own broken cisterns that cannot hold water. So here, again, God refers to himself as living water and says the problem with my people is that they have, on one hand, living water. And this is what they have to offer people. But instead, they've dug cisterns. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been in a cistern or been to look at a cistern or anything like that. I'm a little bit of a history buff, and you can find cisterns in this country in old medieval castles and stuff. And you can even go down into some of them and go like, oh, what on earth? Because they're empty nowadays. Most of them are anyway. But they would be quite nasty places. The water that's in cisterns would have just sat in rock, and it would have been kind of gross, to be honest. It would have been enough to live on in a time of desperation, but it wouldn't be that sweet tasting water that we read about at times in the Bible. And, it's not that sweet stuff that, you kind of get from a river that's flowing down. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to the lakes and stuff, and, on a hot day and, like, just grab some out of a little babbling brook and stuff, and it's like, oh, this tastes nice, unless there's a dead sheep further up. And that's not so nice. But that's another thing. That's a different story. But God says, here I am. My people have chosen to go after cistern water, and they dig broken cisterns, actually stuff that even can't hold water, to give to other people. And God continues to talk about it in a way that he says he is the Mayam Kayam. Isaiah 32:1 says this, says, see, a king will reign in righteousness and rulers will rule with justice. We've talked about this passage. We pointed out that there's one king, a king, but many rulers. So there's one king, King Jesus, many rulers, us. Each one will be like a shelter from the wind and refuge from the storm. We talked about that, shelter and shade. But it continues. It says, like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. See, Isaiah is going to take this idea and he's going to push it into this concept. And it's not just the king who will reign in righteousness, but it's those rulers we talked about before. We will be streams of water in a dry and barren desert. It's not just God who is a stream of water, the Mayim chasm. We are meant to be the Mayim Kayam for other people as well. So staying in Isaiah in chapter 58, he says this, starting at verse 9, he says this, he says, then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and he will say, here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and the malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your lights will rise in the darkness and your nights will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose water never fails. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of the broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. See, in this passage, we see both God says, you need to come to me, and I'm going to refresh you. And at the same time, you're going to be a well-watered garden, and you're going to be a spring that never runs dry. You. And we watch this play back and forth of God trying to teach us in the desert how to trust him, how he is our provision, how he's going to bring water and refreshment and solace into our souls. And in learning that through those tests in the desert, we're not just supposed to learn how to rely on God, but we're also supposed to learn about how we're this refreshment, this source for other people as well. It's two sides of the same coin. It's this continual call. So we have to ask this question, and what is living water? What on earth is it talking about? Well, we've got system water that we talked about. Living water is the opposite. Living water comes from two places, and from one place, but we find it in two kind of sources. So the place that it comes from, living water in Hebrewic language, it comes from the source of God. God, it comes directly from God, and so we find it in two forms: either as a spring from the ground, or rain that's falling. And those would be the two forms of water that come from God. And if you think about the Noah story briefly, like how does God feel? He rains, but he also releases the water from the firmament, from the earth, and the two meet together. The moment that you put it into a cistern, it's no longer living water because it's got there on your own account. The moment you put it into a bucket, it's no longer living water because it's got there on your strength, your account, your help. Mayim Kayam has to come from God, which means it has to come either from the earth or from the sky. And one of the other places that Mayim Kayam showed up was at the festival of Sukkot. Now, the Festival of Sukkot was a week-long celebration, and it was called the Festival of Booths or the Festival of Tabernacles, and it was an 8-day celebration where God's people got together at the temple, and there were different sacrifices every day. And on the last and greatest day of the feast, there was what was called the water ceremony. And we're told in the Gospel of John, in fact, actually, we're going to walk through this through Holy Week, through John, through Holy Week. But we're told in the Gospel of John that Jesus actually goes to the water ceremony, to the Festival of Tabernacles. And he shows up at the temple, and he was teaching, but we need to understand the context of that teaching to understand what Jesus is getting at. At the water ceremony, everybody would have been gathered there, and God would have told his people to go to the temple at Sukkot and to take with them something called a lulav. Lulav, rather, not luva, lulav. Now, the lulav has 3 branches tied together, One of them was from a citrus tree, and it had fruit on. The other is a myrtle, and you kind of have this palm frond, and you have a willow branch in there as well, and you have this palm frond that you tie it all together with. And it's made what's called a lulav. And you can actually Google this on the internet, and you can find them. So they would take these lulavs, and they would take them up to a temple. And there's this wonderful rabbinic tradition about how they even discovered how to use these. Like they ended up at the temple with these things that God told them to make, and then sort of stood around wondering what to do with them, because God said make them, but he didn't tell them what to do with them. And so they're just held there, and there's this, like I say, there's this beautiful rabbinic story that there was this young child who was stood amongst all of them with them, and he just started to shake it, and the rabbis were like, "Oh, that sounds like rain." And he says, "Oh, this palm frond, when you shake it, it sounds like rain." And so they got everybody to shake their palm fronds together. Now it's great actually, but this has landed on Palm Sunday, because we have our palm crosses. And if I'd have been more organised, I would have bought some palm fronds, some proper things to demonstrate and to shake together. And I don't know how many of you have ever been in churches that have the big palm fronds and sort of experienced this when they're walking around and heard the rattle of them. But if you can imagine, thousands, hundreds of thousands of these palm fronds together. And they're like, we're going to celebrate harvest. And we must be here to thank God for the rain from this year, and to pray and ask him for rain for next year. That's why we must be here. And so they started this water ceremony, and they gathered everyone together with their lulavs and their palm fronds, and they would shake the fronds, and the priest would come out with this jar. And he comes out, and everybody has their palm fronds, and they're shouting, and they're getting really excited, and they're shouting, "Hosanna, Hosanna," which means Lord, save us. Ring any bells? We've said it today already. And you ask, well, why are they shouting that? Why are they shouting Hosanna? Well, because actually it's a bit of a weird thing to shout for a water ceremony. But they get it from the text. Psalm 118 says this, "The stone the builder rejected," should be familiar. "The stone the builder rejected has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The Lord has done it this very day. Let us rejoice today and be glad. Lord, save us. Hosanna. Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord we bless you. The Lord is God, and he has made his light shine on us. With bows in hand, join in the festival procession up to the horns of the altar." So we have this. Lord, save us. Lord, grant us success. The Hebrew there is Hosanna, Hosanna, with bows in hand. The text says it. It tells us what to do. And so they stand at the temple, and they have the lulavs, and they shout Hosanna. And what they're asking is, they're saying, "God, save us. You gave us rain this year. Give us rain next year. Give us a good crop again, because we're dependent upon you. We're enjoying it. Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. We need you." And they get up into this huge frenzy. And then, like I say, the priest walks up with this jar up the ramp to the altar with this pitcher in his hand, and everybody falls dead silent. And he tips the pitcher up, and there's nothing in the pitcher. There's nothing in this jar. It's empty. Then the priest descends down the ramp from the altar, and everybody shakes their palm fronds again, shouts Hosanna again, and there's all this writing about how you could have heard the shouting of Sukkot from miles away, as hundreds of thousands, maybe even a million people all shouting Hosanna at the top of their voices. And then the priest would have got down to the pool of Siloam, and he fills up his pitcher, and then he would walk back up to the temple with everybody getting so excited and worked up because they know what's going to happen. And they're shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, Lord, grant us success. Lord, save us. Lord, save us. Give us rain for the harvest. And then the priest would come back and he would go up the steps of a ramp again, and everybody again would fall dead silent. And they would wait. And the priest would walk up the ramp, and he would take his pitcher, and this time he would pour it out, and there would be water. And as it hit the burning coals, smoke obviously would be produced, steam and flames, and the fire would go, and it would cause, that would represent the presence of God. Remember what happened in Exodus: the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of fire, the smoke by day. And they're recreating that. And everybody would cheer and celebrate. Now, what we're told in the Jesus story is that during the last and greatest day of the feast, which is the water ceremony, Jesus goes up to the temple, and it says he cries out these words: "Whoever is thirsty, let him come to me, and streams of living water will flow out of him." The question is, when does he say that? Does he say that when everybody is shouting Hosanna, waving their palm fronds, creating this rain sound that can be heard from miles and miles and miles away? Or does he say that when it's silent? See, it's when the crowd is silent and say, wait for the priest to pour the jug, to pour that water out. If you can imagine this eerie moment where everybody is all worked up and they're all excited, and suddenly there's this voice from the back: "If anyone is thirsty," it becomes this stunning, amazing teaching moment all of a sudden. But what Jesus says reinforces what we've been looking at here in our passages. What he says is, I was rocked when I discovered this. I knew this passage really well, but I didn't know it well enough because I stumbled across this teaching and I literally shouted out loud, this can't be really it. Jesus says, if anybody's thirsty and will come to me, streams of living water will flow. And I thought, well, it flows from Jesus. But that's not what the text says. It says it'll flow from you. I will quench your thirst so that you can quench the thirst of other people. If anyone is thirsty, let them come to me, and streams of Mayam Kayam, streams of living water will flow from within him, from within you. And really quickly, because it's nearly 10 past, there's one more image I want to talk about really quickly, and that is flooding. What do you think is the biggest cause of death in the desert? You'd think first, wouldn't you? It's not, it's flooding. I gave you the clue. And it's crazy, isn't it? Because you automatically go like, it must be thirst or hunger or exposure or something like that. But it's not, it's flooding. The number one cause of death in these deserts anyway is flooding. These woodies flood, and they come out of nowhere, and they sound kind of like a train coming. And apparently, if you hear the waters coming and you're in the bottom of a wadi, you're stuffed. You might run, but you're not going to run quick enough. You might try to climb, but you're not going to climb quick enough. And this huge wall of water is going to come crashing through this wadi. And now, and again, you can go on YouTube and search up wadis flooding. Usually, they're not as impressive as possible because they're usually taken from the top where it's safe. Because obviously if you've got, there might be somebody who's put a GoPro down there and waited, but usually they're taken from the top, and it's like, oh, that's pretty cool. But if you can imagine being at the bottom, 40 foot down, with this huge wave of water coming, and they're deadly for anybody that's inside of it, inside of a wadi. There's no escape. And one of the places that this shows up is in Jesus' teaching. And he talks about it at the end of the Sermon of the Mount. And he says this, he says, the person who hears my words and does not do them is like the man who built his house on the sand. And the rain comes and the floodwaters rose, and it says, and his house was destroyed. But the man who hears my words and does them is like the one who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floodwaters rose, but his house stood firm as the wind beat against the house. Now, the words he used there are quite interesting. We kind of miss this because of the English translations. Sand is what you would find at the bottom of a wadi. That's the only place you find sand in these deserts, is at the bottom of these wadis. And there are two different types of sand in the Middle East. There's the sand of the seashore. Sorry, I forgot about the seashore. If you go to Tel Aviv, there's sand there. But then there's the sand of the desert. The sand of the desert gathers at the bottom of these wadis because that's where the water carries the sand. And the sand sits at the bottom of a wadi, and the word for rock that Jesus used there is the word for bedrock or cliff. It's at the top of a wadi. It's kind of reversed to our normal way of thinking. And what Jesus is saying here ends up taking on a whole new life. It's really not about building material that I've probably preached before in my life. It's not about strong or weak building foundations. It's about location. As Phil and whatever, Kirsty would tell you, it's all about location, location, location. See, the foolish person that doesn't do what Jesus says is like a person who builds a home at the bottom of a wadi. And it may feel cool and relaxed and chilled until the storm comes. And that storm isn't necessarily where the house is. It can be miles away. And then suddenly the water rushes in. But the person who hears Jesus' words and builds his house is in the rock, is a person who builds at the top of a wadi, where there is no danger of being hurt. And you'll find this all throughout the rest of Scripture as well. The Hebrew Scripture talks about, David says, I was stuck in the mire. I was stuck in the mud and I was hopeless. David cries out and he says, God came and he pulled me out of the mire. He pulled me out of the mud and he rescued me and he put my feet up on the rock. See, the mud that he talks about in that passage is the mud of the wadi, is the sand of the wadi. And he says, I was stuck in the mud and I could hear the water coming, and the only way I could escape, the only thing I was going to help me is God. God plucked me out of the wadi and he put me on the rock face, on the top. And he took me out of danger. So those are the images in Scripture that come alive when we have the right picture. Wadi, living water, and flooding. Where are we placing our lives? What's our location? Are we living water for other people? Is the things that we're taking in, are we giving out? And have we learned to hear his voice? Because life is sometimes like wadis. In fact, I would generally say that life is always like a wadi. In that, I sometimes think that we always know where we're going, but we don't, if we're honest. But are we learning to trust his voice? Amen? Amen. Amen.